pretty much, I think, the perfect place, the perfect festival to talk about all the things that we want to talk about. Because one thing that I love so much about Madras particularly is that you can say anything here and you know you'll have support as long as it's, something, a liberal sentiment, something that doesn't cater to bigots. I think this is one of the places that stands strongest against that. And Huma, Shiny, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start with, I'm going to address the elephant in the room. So what is Huma Qureshi, whom we all know as an actor, and who's just written her first novel, and Shiny Anthony, who is well known as the organizer of the Bangalore Literature Festival. Thank you so much for gracing our festival. The director of the Bangalore Poetry Festival, writer of several books, editor of various anthologies, and a scholar of great standing of several decades' experience. So what are the two of them doing together on the same platform? And I think it all begins with the fact that both their books deal with women, how women are seen by women, how women are seen by men, and how women see themselves. Now, Shiny, of course, has written several books, of which the latest is Eden Abandoned, the story of Lilith. And to most people, Lilith is not a known name. It's a name that's been erased from the Bible. But Lilith is the first wife of Adam, for those who don't know it, and we'll get into that in more detail. And Huma's book, Zeba, as you can see, deals with a woman, a superhero in a cape, which is a hijab. And as you can see, is red in color. So with that, I think I'm going to begin with you, Shiny. So let's begin with the creation myth. Now, a lot of people who are raised in, let's say, Catholic households speak of the guilt which is fostered upon them very early for original sin. And you sort of unravel original sin itself. And I don't want to give too much away, but you speak about how even in the commission of original sin, man is given the role even of the antagonist, whereas the antagonist was not really a man. The snake was not really a man. And you'll have to read this book. It's a wonderful book. It's a slim book, beautifully designed, and I think it will make you unlearn a lot of what you know. So I want to talk a little bit about your upbringing. Were you raised in a Catholic household? And in what way did it influence, let's say, the idea of shame? Because that's a concept which recurs constantly here.
My dad was a complete atheist, and I was brought up in Delhi. So I don't think that the typical Catholic upbringing applies to me. But yes, the larger extended family and all our, birth, marriages, and death. I'll be buried in some church cemetery, I'm sure. So the larger structure is definitely Catholic. And I am actually, after I wrote this, because, this book, a lot of people think it's about Christianity. It's actually Jewish mythology. Lilith is Jewish, a Jewish cult figure. And like I was telling you, rediscovered by Jewish feminists in the 19th century. And actually, they started a magazine, the first Jewish feminist magazine, and it was called Lilith. And one of the earliest short stories in the 19th century talks about the sisterhood bond between Lilith and Eve. Lilith climbs over the walls of Eden and rescues Eve. Unlike what we feel about our love rivals, they are supposed to have bonded in complete sisterhood. So.
Initially I was saying, I'm not going to try and find similarities between the two books. I'm going to treat them as entities in themselves and speak to the authors. But I couldn't help finding similarities in the two books. And Huma, I'm going to toss that to you. You were raised in Delhi as well. And I know you once said in an interview that everything was within a 5-kilometer radius. And now suddenly your world has expanded to encompass the entire world. I mean, your first film premiered at Cannes. So I was there. But covering the festival. So, just in case anyone thought I was in Gangs of Wasepur too as a trio.
Who knows, huh? It was a pretty extensive cast, so maybe.
Could be the girl behind the tree. But yeah, so you were raised in Delhi, and in a fairly liberal household, as was the main character of your book. But then the this character, I mean, unlike, so you would look at this and think, okay, Zeba, you see the kind of script which has an Arabic calligraphy sort of twist to it. Now, Zeba is a pot-smoking New York resident who has a therapist, like all rich New York residents do, and who is like, oh man, I don't want to save the world. I'd rather smoke pot. Oh, now I'm the chosen one. So that's her reaction. So can you tell me a little bit about the creation of Zeba?
Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's quite a cool thing to come to one of my favorite cities, but this time as an author and not just as an actor. And thank you for coming in such huge numbers to do this. I think it's really heartening. I'm obsessed with the idea of misfits saving the world, especially women who are not seen conventional. And I love, and I think that was the genesis of the idea. Also the fact that it was COVID and I had all this time on my hands, and otherwise you're constantly running from one film set to the other. And that's how this kind of was the seed of this idea. And also the fact that we always imagine superheroes to come in a particular form, shape, size, and say lines and sort of have a holier than thou kind of a backstory. And I was like, why can't a person who's maybe a product of this fractured world, is a reflection of the realities of this modern world, but could also end up being a superhero? It's almost like you don't have to come in a particular form or say the right things. So this was my version of a reluctant superhero. Pot-smoking, badly behaved, potty-mouthed, sassy, one-liners, you name it, every flaw in the book. So I was almost afraid that when people would read it, would they even like her? Because she's nothing like the, shining, powdered, manicured, well-behaved women that we like to see, we like to hear of. No, she breaks every rule in the book and then some more.
We'll get to the wild women part with Shiny, but before that, so the idea of sisterhood is something we find in your book also. So it's like literally every page in both these books is a revelation, and we're using a lot of biblical terms like Genesis, Revelation, all of this in the wrong context biblically. But but then I don't want to give too much away, but right from Zeba's birth to her, let's say, to the decision that's made on her upbringing, to her discovery of her powers, everything happens because of sisterhood, right? And was that conscious, or did it just unfold? And sorry, in case if it whatever it was, what do you think influenced the thought behind it?
I think it was unconscious, to be honest, but because I feel like sisterhood is something that I have experienced very beautifully in my own life. So a lot of things, decisions, I don't know, achievements I've managed to, garner for myself have happened because of a lot of love, support, care, from the women around me. And I don't think in popular media we talk about that or represent that enough. It's always about the cat fights and who's bitching whom, and I can't stand you, and if you're gonna if a man is gonna cheat on a woman, it has to be about the two women and not about the partner who's actually cheating. And I felt like that's a very horrible way of looking at it. And I think in my life I've been nurtured by a lot of women around me, and I don't know what I would do with my sisters, my female friends. And I think it just kind of made its way, because I do something which is, I don't know what your process of writing is. I'm not a author, in the sense
now you are.
I'm the reluctant author. But my style of writing is very unconscious, free-flowing, wake up in the morning while doing my morning pages, and you sort of let it flow without really trying to put a structure to it. And I think it just crept its way into it, all the things I think I believe somewhere, in my head, including the sisterhood angle.
Right, so the wild women that I wanted to talk about, now Zeba does whatever the hell she wants to, and becomes a superhero along the way. Now Lilith was cast out. The version I had heard, and I think the version which most people hear, without going into the details, was that she was cast out of Eden for some error on her part. May I say why? So she's cast out of Eden because when Adam wants to sleep with her, she insists that she will be on top. And this is not fictional, this is the actual myth. So
What a dummy.
So can you like tell us about your discovery of the myth and how that's, I mean, because then you've gone on to, Lilith is heartbroken at first, but then she becomes her own woman and there's this beautiful, she essentially becomes her own woman through sex. So can you just talk a little bit about your discovery of the Lilith myth and then your recreation or your creation of Lilith as her own woman?
So she discovers that to make one man unspecial, she has to make many men special. That's the part that you're talking about. But she also, like Uma said, discovers that, you know, we are kind of conditioned to think there's this one man or there's this soulmate. And most of us, of course, are presumed also to be hetero. So there is this one man who is waiting for you. And if that doesn't work out for some reason, then your whole life is destroyed and you're distraught. And then, you know, no other love is going to replace this. But what she also realizes that finding Miss Right for herself, finding the perfect female friend who's been through everything that she's been through, who has the same hormones, who has the same biology, who has the same way of thinking, and who has also suffered under the patriarchy, who has also undergone that same drill that most women do. I think the potential of friendship between two women, it's infinite, it's immense. And sometimes it's not tapped. And I also apologize because I feel when I was younger, I did not think that way. I wasn't really conscious and aware of the women around me, and if they were getting a fair deal, I wasn't really thinking about that so much. I was blessed with an extremely feminist father who brought me up like in the center of his palm, and I thought the world is that. The world is going to greet me as an equal. And it's only when you set out into the world that you realize that some people have a harder fight than you do. So I feel with Lilith, she did fall in love with Adam very, because he was the only man and she was the only woman. It's not like she had a choice. You know, he was just attractive to her because there was no other man also. But this whole thing about being on top, I think was probably, I'm just thinking for her, is also probably her thinking that that was the best form of birth control, and that was her taking her pleasure into her own hands, and she was going to steer the relationship, the physical part of it, and therefore then she could probably be in the driver's seat in the emotional part of it. So when she's cast out and she walks out of Eden, she walks and she walks without a backward look for a long time. And finally, when she turns around and looks, Eden is just like this tiny dot far away. And the rest of earth is hers.
You know, you spoke about being protected and then out into the world, and that reminds me a lot of what happened to you. It's something you've spoken about, but I remember seeing you at Cannes for the first time, and you know, this young new actor who has the chops. I mean, you were speaking a dialect which is completely alien to you at Gangs of Wasseypur, and that was your first film, right? First film that you shot, and everyone was going on about this beautiful face she has, and there was a but. But if she lost some weight, you know, she'd be right at the top. And that's haunted you. I mean, I wouldn't say haunted, but that's accompanied you because you haven't allowed it to haunt you, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's something.
Because like Lilith, I also prefer being on top.
But no, that's something, there's always this but. I mean, and the idea that a woman has to look, not just look up, because you've spoken about how when you were growing up, you've never found anything wrong with how you look, and I don't think that's vain. I think that's perfectly, because you always apologize for it, saying it's not vanity, but no, so you've never been kind of body shamed before you came to, you know, cinema, right?
Right. I think as women, a very big part of our experience is to be shamed. We are always constantly shamed, whether at home or in school or colleges or within families. It's like it's almost like, I don't know, Cerelac, like, oh, one chammach of shame before you step out into the world, or one chammach of shame when you come back. You know, it's part of our, I don't know.
That's fantastic.
experience.
I think that deserves a round of applause. Yes.
So I think, and like you said, I had a very, very nurturing family. Like, I think they were very conservative in their own, because when you said like, they were fairly like open or progressive, I think that's fairly with most Indian families is the operative word, But having said that, I think I had all the luxuries, and all the advantages that education and other things and confidence that they could have given me. But I feel like, because as women we are constantly shamed, I'd never let it bother me because I feel like I've been now working 2012, my first film released. We're in 2023. I've been working every single year of my life.
25 now.
Sorry, we are.
Time traveled a little
The
bit.
2 COVID years. It's always that.
Discounted.
2025 now. And I've been working every single year. I've always been busy. I think wherever I go in the country, I've worked in, I get a lot of love. I've worked in every industry possible, including overseas, including whether it's OTT or, multiplex or the pan-India film experience. I've had all of them. So I feel like even if I did, who's to guarantee that I would have this kind of a flourishing career? So I feel like, and I don't want to be the torchbearer of any kind of like, any kind of ideology. But I think if my existence is making people question their own beliefs, then so be it.
Reluctant superhero again.
That's part of the psychology.
And shame again is it's something which I think every religion uses that as a tool against women, right? This idea of shame.
Every culture.
No, and I say religion specifically because now temples have a dress code, gurudwaras have a dress code, mosques have a dress code, dargahs have a dress code. Every place, the churches have a dress code. So every place that you go to, and a lot of the shame centers around hair. And hair is sexualized, like there are so many people like, oh, look at those girls with loose hair. I just want to plait it. I've heard so many aunties say this all my life. And my friends have turned into those aunties now, like, look at those girls, I want to plait their hair.
Yeah, because you can show your navel wearing a sari, but not your hair.
Yeah, not your hair. And you see this all the time in scooters and things. You'll have these women who, you can see like 1.5 feet of stomach, of midriff, but then their faces are covered. And they have a point. As long as you don't know whose midriff it is, I suppose it's fine to look at it.
Oh, that explains a lot of women peeing on the side of the roads.
So Shiny, a hair is a very important motif in Eden Abandoned. Both Lilith's hair, Eve's less glorious hair. And what happens as in, I'll leave you to speak about how hair is used to cover one's shame. And then hair itself becomes a form of shame.
Lilith is supposed to have had golden hair. And because those days there are no hairdressers or barbers. So your hair just keeps growing. And then it probably went beyond her feet. And that was my imagination, that it's probably just, And that was the only outfit she wore before shame made an appearance in the Bible, in the story. And then she had to find, trees and barks and leaves and everything. But I just want to say that if women were supposed to be ashamed and guilty and shame was their middle name, and like you said, we were fed spoonfuls of shame all our life. I think for men, the thing was anger. The counter emotion that men was found attractive or stereotypical for men is anger. And an angry man is like very seductive. An aggressive man is considered protective. He's very masculine. He's attractive to women. And it's like a peacock dance. His display of anger when his girlfriend or the love of his life is around, that's like a peacock dance. Like, look at me, this is how I spend my emotions. And an angry woman, on the other hand, is an oxymoron. You're not supposed to be angry. Even the way we laugh, we are taught how to laugh, like gently, into a palm. We're not supposed to make a noise when we laugh. So, no proposal comes from a man saying, there is this woman I know, she's young, she's hot, she loses her temper bloody 24/7. You should meet her. No proposal comes for a man like that. It's the opposite. However angry and irritated and annoyed you are at home, your relatives will go and describe you as, she's so gentle, she's docile, I've never seen her losing her temper. So this is the way that women are advertised and men are, praised.
Such a trap, no? Such a trap.
No, it's such a trap. And I feel when women can use their anger judiciously, which is what we are learning now. And for me, again, it's a superpower that's come from aging. I feel I know now how to get angry in the right way, that people don't say, oh, it's that time of the month. She's just like,
oh, yes,
she's hysterical. So an angry woman who's articulate is a complete work of art.
Wow. And while we are speaking about shame, now, I mean, I was intrigued by the fact now the Zeba hates the idea of a hijab. I mean, she speaks about coloring her hair and, but the superhero version of her wears a hijab. And I'd like for you to talk about it largely because I think this is such a censored subject. And, like we were talking about this earlier, because of your surname, much can be made of this. But I think this is a platform where people won't make much of it and where it's really important in a place like this to articulate what you really feel about it. Because the hijab is, in one way, it's used as a form of resistance, like, let's say in Turkey. There were people saying, you can't tell us what to wear. It's happening in India in some places, happening in France in some places. In Iran, there's a woman who's like walking about in her underclothes in the university saying, don't tell me what to wear, I'll choose what not to wear. And then there are men who say, oh, but we're just protecting them. And I'm like, why can't you wear straight jackets if you want to protect them? Why ask them to cover their hair? So can you tell me a little bit about your superhero's relationship with the hijab and her opinions on it?
I feel like because Zeba was raised in New York and raised like a rich New Yorker with all the wonderful access to wealth and everything it could buy, she, of course, had a very Western understanding of the hijab. Having said that, I feel like whether it's a hijab or a miniskirt or a bikini, it's the woman's choice to decide what she wants to wear. And I think much is made about it, oh, this is oppressive and that is not. But I do know a lot of women, for example, if you force them to wear a bikini and go to the beach, they'd be very uncomfortable. And I feel like we are constantly trying to put our understanding of what is right and what is not right. For a lot of people, maybe a hijab or a burqa or a parda is a form of their, celebration of womanhood. And I feel as long as it's pro-choice and no one is forcing anyone to do it, that's the way one should look at it. And to be honest, in the book, I use the hijab because for a superhero, the most important thing is to be, in disguise. So I'm like, here you are. Like, let's use something that is so misunderstood globally, but use it as a symbol of actually freedom and celebration of what it is to be a woman.
And this is something which I mean, from the writing of it, I feel it happens spontaneously. I don't think it's something you set out to do. And did your own understanding of, let's say, the hijab change as you were writing this, do you think?
My understanding of everything changed. I think when you write something, like, it always depends on the reader, how they are receiving it. Like, I was very concerned, say, for example, how my mother would respond to it. Because, and I do remember, like, literally the eve of the publication release date, I suddenly got anxiety and I called my agent saying, have you made a mistake? Here I am as an actor and I say one interview and, I'm used to where people just troll me for it, or they take out articles and YouTube videos and I'm misquoted all the time. And like a dumbass, I've written a book, so now they can have a field day with this material and I could really get butchered for it. And I really got a lot of anxiety and they were like, don't worry, it's a cleverly written book. And a lot of people who do all of this, I mean, they don't know how to read. So I got saved by that. No, but having said that, I think it's what you make of it. And there are a few chapters in it which talk about faith and understanding of faith and, how personal that experience is to most people. And whether you look at it scientifically or you look at it from the lens of an Eastern mystical guru or a quantum physicist, we all take back and we always apply our understanding and our vocabulary to understanding these phenomena, but they all exist. So it's what you want to make of that experience and how you want to customize that experience for yourself.
When we'll get back to sisterhood, and I'd like you, I think, right towards the end, to read a little bit from your books. You know, things which, which speak to you. Let's say about any passage from the book which you feel is sort of the essence of the book. So we'll keep the last couple of minutes maybe for that. But I want to, so this idea when we were speaking about shame, about there's this one, I mean, a passage which really, really moved me and left me almost in tears, because there's this woman who is punished for essentially having sex with the man whom she wants to have sex with, right? And there's 100, I mean, this is part of the myth itself. So, what moved me was how beautifully Shiny has written it. But the myth is that Lilith will lose 100 sons. I think the myth, not in your book, but the myth says she will birth and lose 100 children every day for the rest of her life. And you have written such a beautiful passage on this, where, you know, the process of birthing those children and watching them die. And therefore, in the myth, Lilith becomes this succubus, this woman who goes around seducing men in their sleep and birthing their sons and swallowing their sperm when they are alone, right? So, and here you bring in this actual, the woman behind the vamp, the woman behind the devil, the woman behind the, you know, that kind of monster that Lilith is made out to be. And you see her in her most primitive maternal form, raw form. Can you talk a little bit about writing that passage?
So the super myth about her is that she is the patron demoness of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. So when I had to explain that, and also she loved eating, munching, chewing on little babies, and she loved the soft cartilage, and, you know, it was like popcorn to her. And so I just wanted to give a context to that, as to why was she doing that, you know. And my interpretation of it is that she wants to free women from motherhood. She wants women to go find what they have to do in life without this whole yoke of motherhood, which is socially placed on her shoulders. So she can do a lot of other stuff. So she has this entire park full of seesaws and seas of breast milk, which the babies whom she takes away from the mortal world and gives it to them. And you know, the word lullaby comes from Lilith. So it is the song, or the song that women sang to their babies and to ward Lilith off. And that's why it's called lullaby. It's Lilith by.
And in Huma's book, the superhero, I mean, this comes early in the book, so it's not too much of a giveaway. But the superhero, 2B's mother, actually wants her dead. And this is out of the greatest maternal love. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of that scene? Like, how did that idea occur to you?
So the story takes place in a make-believe kingdom called Khudir, which it's basically a landlocked country, imaginary, up in the Himalayas. Imaginary because obviously we can't place it in a real setting, we'll get into trouble, etc., etc. So Khudir, imagine like Nepal and Abu Dhabi had a baby. That's Khudir for you. And has an evil king who obviously has a lot of, I mean, I don't want to give away because this part of the story also unfolds in many chapters, why this happened, etc., etc. But he basically has a lot of young women kidnapped who he uses for, you know, sexual pleasure. And one of them, a very young girl, is in childbirth when that story starts. And the king is away traveling and she has this baby and it's a baby girl. And she obviously tells Khairun, and the midwife. Khairun is this eunuch, the palace eunuch who takes care of her. And the midwife saying, you can't let that evil king lay his hands on this little child. You have to take her and you have to kill her. Just promise me before she dies. And then it falls upon the eunuch to actually ride a horse and travel a few hours away to the holy spring water called Zaza. where she has to drown the little child and the little infant within a few hours of her being born and been taken away from the mother, and the mother dies. And then, of course, Zaza resurrects the baby because she ends up being the superhero.
But the idea of the mother wanting the child dead for her own good, it's essentially mercy killing, right? And this is something, and also, I mean, I'm not going to give away that there's a larger significance to her wanting the child dead, but then it is an act of mercy killing because of what will happen to that child. I mean, to grow up with those restrictions. And this is a motif which we see across religions of children being, I mean, you of course you have, Bhishma's the child who lived and look at what life he lived, right? And this again, this idea of the 100 evil sons being killed so that they would not turn into 100 evil sons. And those are recurring motifs across mythologies. And I kind of...
I mean, mythology is barbaric, I guess.
So yeah, I think the question I was asking is, what was it which inspired that scene of a mother wanting the child dead? Is there anything, or did it just, I mean, you can't
I think
remember?
it was an act of like absolute sacrifice. Also the fact that I think when Zeba grew up, she was a child who believed she was an orphan or was abandoned, or at least may have been a product of like a survivor of female infanticide, and then she carries the scars of that. And I wanted to, for some reason, like give the protagonist each and every experience what it is to be a woman, And I feel like all of these are different facets that maybe one individual cannot have, but many different people end up having from all across different cultures and all over the world. And I just wanted to maybe capture a bit of that because she carries all those scars collectively, that a lot of women carry.
I mean, I wish there were time for one. I just have time for one last question before we start the reading. But then I wanted to speak about the idea of taking the Lord's name in vain, which is, Lilith's big sin. And here in India, just as Hindus say, yo Rama, yo Krishna, whatever it is, a lot of them, oh Jesus. And they mean as, oh, Jesus, not as in Jesus, that kind of thing. So I'd just like you to, I mean, they don't say the Lord's name, I guess, but the name of Jesus. So can you talk a little bit about the idea of taking the Lord's name in vain? It's a recurring idea through the book.
In the context of Lilith.
In the context of Christianity, maybe, but maybe, I mean, whichever
no, in the context of Lilith, it is very significant because unlike Eve, whom Adam actually almost parents because he's put to sleep and then she's come off her body, she's come off his body. So basically they are related also. But Lilith and Adam were created together by God, and they were created with all these waterfalls and lava and volcanoes and mud and soil and all of that with just the natural elements. They were both created at the same time and brought to life at the same time. But it's almost like even then there was this special support, like women's cell thing, you give a phone number to women who are in distress. God tells her, whispers into only her ear that this is my name and you will call me if you ever want me. But Adam understands it differently because for him God is everything. And Eve always wants to have that daughter to father connection with God. She always wants to tell him everything. She wants his approval. She wants him to like her for who she is. Whereas Adam is the only child of the only God, only son of the only God at that time. And he wants to be like, first class, first ayah huma types, He wants to always have the brownie points. So he is always barring her from using God's name. And when she does use God's name, God also doesn't take it too well.
And there's a very interesting reference to taking the Lord's name in vain. And I'll leave you to speak about that in your book, in Zeba.
Well, so Zeba once ends up taking the Lord's name in vain, and then
she just says Jesus.
Yeah, but and then she gets chastised by her father, saying if you have to at least take your own God's name in vain.
So yeah, we are. I'd like you to read a little bit. Maybe I don't know if you've picked a section that you want to read, Shiny. Maybe. No, we can have just like that one paragraph. We can open it for questions. In the do we
Reading
have
a question, what do you
questions
guys
from
want?
the audience?
Questions? Okay, they want questions.
Who'd like a reading and who'd like questions?
Okay, everyone with the reading, raise your hands. Okay, everyone for questions, raise your hands.
I think reading wins. Maybe we'll do a short reading and 2 questions. 10 minutes, right? Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to say it from my memory, but
no,
if
like, you want the book?
No, it's okay. I'm going to read something else.
Oh yeah, sure.
So in case I forget, just pretend I'm still speaking. Once upon a time, there was no time, no once, just he and me, a good man, a bad woman, naked and curious, just dying to know. But before that, there was a snake and a fruit, apple, I think. I'm Eve, the world's first woman, fresh off the boat, chromosome XX. And Adam, too busy tracking water, rubbing stones for fire. And then one day I died. I became a ghost, a female ghost. Breasts, smoke rings, uterus, water vapor. I was just hanging around when I saw a man bash a woman up with her own baby. I moved closer. I raised my hand, up came hers. She, me, we hit him hard. No one sees me. They see a meek woman with years of nodding behind her. On moonless nights, I paced words on girl tongues, fighting words. But enough about me. We ghosts have work to do. You there, open your gob. Let me coat your sweet little tongue with dissent. Come, my beautiful descendant. We have a no to say.
So I'm a bit torn, but I think the bit I want to read is about the evil king and what happened, like what happened to his father, that section. Finally, after 2 hours of digging, they managed to free the king. But the person whom they rescued from under the pile of rubble was no longer the king they had known. He was half gone.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to make it clear that the king referred to here is the father of the evil king. And
Correct. The king referred to over here as the father of the evil king. So the king is just called as the evil king, like for our reference. And Zayed is the name of the king we're talking about over here. So what really happened? So Zayed, the benevolent, had lost both his arms and legs and had been reduced to a stump. Barely alive, the king managed to instruct his son, which is our present-day evil king, to take him to a nearby tribal village that may have escaped being bombed because it was situated in the cover of a looming hill. The young Khan handed his little brother Umar to a kind woman. The Shah's followers pointed the Khan to an abandoned old bull cart, and the young boy reverently placed King Zayed on it. With no beasts of burden in sight, he dragged the cart himself until they reached their destination. The rest of the few hundred survivors grabbed whatever they could get their hands on in this mad rush to get to safety. Money, jewelry, family heirlooms, furniture, utensils, livestock, food, and water. Then they left the village forever, following in the Khan's footsteps. This day went down in Khudir's history as the Black Day, and the young Khan's journey to safety, the Hijr of Shah. So take a moment, dear reader, for an interesting exercise. This is for everyone. Ask yourself this. What is the one thing you will take before running out of your house in a case of a fire or flood or war? What is that one thing you would tuck under your arm or lift over your head or hide under your coat? What would you take with you if you had to leave overnight? Money, passports, keys to your house for when you can return, a lover's old shirt, a dead man's bones in an urn, an iPhone charger. I mean, it is important. A bottle of rum, a photograph, your diary. You see, one can tell a lot about a person by the prized possessions they reach for at a terrifying time like this. I would like you to truly know and acknowledge that authentic aspect of yourself. In short, You are what you grab. Apologies if that sounds totally inappropriate.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much. Questions? I saw several raised hands. Yes.
Yeah, this is to you. I'm a great admirer of
Hi,
all
ma'am.
your things.
Could you
Especially-
position the mic?
Especially after watching Maharani, I thought you were a older woman.
I know it's called acting.
Why have you not got your dues? I feel you have not got your dues as an actress in the Bollywood or Hindi
They're lost
movie.
entirely, ma'am.
And did you learn any Tamil when you acted with our
Konjam,
superstar?
konjam Tamil, ma'am. Not too much. Very konjam. Vanakkam.
Yes.
Saptingla?
There's a lady with a mic here. Oh, that's the most important thing. Yeah, the most important thing. Yeah.
I think I want to change the mic.
No,
You,
no.
Buland Awaz.
Another question directed towards Huma. Apologies for this. You said about the exercise in your book, about the thing that you would pick up during, in case of an emergency, a black day. What would be the one thing that you would pick up for yourself if you were in such a situation?
Definitely iPhone charger. I mean that's like your whole world right there. Anything is possible. But I have a little box actually in which I keep some photographs. I know nobody keeps like those printed photographs anymore. But I have some of my childhood and some people who are no longer there, older people from the family. I'll definitely carry that. iPhone, credit cards, passport. The list is getting longer. I don't know. I hope none of us have to ever endure that situation, you know, because it doesn't matter from which part of the world you are. You could, I don't think anybody should ever be subjected to ever leaving their home in a situation like that. I think it's really unfortunate.
I mean, we joke about it, but then, you know, it's happening in Palestine. It's been happening for a year and 3 months now.
So whether it happens in Palestine or it happens in LA, human life and to be uprooted from what really means something to you, I think it's really terrifying and heartbreaking. And I really wish that upon, I don't wish this upon anybody in this world.
The lady there.
Hello, ma'am. Firstly, my name is Mahima. Secondly, you've written that it is important to create stories that your younger self would like to read. So, how does this personal mission of yours drive to shape your portrayal of women in fiction?
Well, this book came out from that because I don't think I had like a role model like that to look up to. And I've constantly felt like, you know, I didn't have enough people who looked and sounded like me, you know, and because I never had that while growing up, I wish that if I today am in a position, I'd be able to do something about it. So whether those roles I tend to pick out when I'm doing my films, or the fact that Zeba came from that place.
We only have time for 2 more questions. No, please hold on. I'll pick. 2 questions for Shiny, please. Anyone who has questions for Shiny.
And gentleman in the
please.
green
No,
and
you
here.
in front. Yeah. Could we have a mic here in the front? Any questions that you have left? I mean, because I know there are people who want to ask you questions as well. So any questions that you have left which we don't have time for, you can buy their books, line up, get their signatures and ask your questions. You in front, please.
So I would like to ask you what it is to challenge religion in writing. What are the things that a writer should? Do you ever think while writing that okay, you are challenging something so sensitive like the religion?
I think the only thing I kept in mind is that religion is man-made. And I really did want women to come into the picture.
Thank you.
One last question for Shiny. Yeah.
Yeah, hi ma'am, glad to meet you. And so my question is directed to both of you. So I wanted to ask, it might be a cliched question, but I just wanted to get your view on that. So how do the cultural connotations of our nation, like the society that we've been brought up in, how much do you think it is, influence both of your creations?
We've covered that, I think, during our conversation. One last question, please, for Shiny. The lady at the back. Uh, could we pass a mic to the lady at the back, please? No, that's okay. No one can hear you there, so yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound like a school teacher,
No
but I think
worries.
it's habit.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, no, former school teacher, I totally get it. So, this question is for both of you, but primarily for Shiny. So, a lot of pushback towards powerful women in fiction has been that it's not realistic, quote unquote. Have y'all experienced that during your publishing process? And do you all have any advice for dealing with that as women existing in the world, where anything that is about powerful women immediately gets shut down, usually by men, funnily enough, as not being realistic?
I did feel that once you cross your 40s, women undergo a mysterious, they attain some kind of a cloak of invisibility. You know, when you're younger and you enter a lift and there's a man who enters, you keep your eyes down because, you know, if you look up, he is looking directly at you because it's just the two of you in that small space. But then comes a time when you are in the lift with someone and then that's it. I mean, they just spread out. It's like we need aeroplanes for men and women, because whenever I'm sitting on a flight next to a man, my entire that armrest and everything belongs to him. I don't exist. He doesn't see me. His elbow digs into my side and he doesn't notice that, you know. So I do feel that being single is a superpower, being childless is a superpower, and aging is a superpower.
That I think is a fantastic note to end on.